which is, in fact, cognition is not intrinsically conscious. A major discovery of the last 20 years of the 20th century, or rediscovery, if you'll forgive me for putting it that, bearing in mind I'm a psychoanalyst, was that most of our mental functions are, in fact, performed unconsciously. And most of cognition does not require consciousness. In fact, when you look at how much we can do unconsciously in regard to cognition, it really has led seriously to the question, what on earth is the consciousness for? Because it's not clear what it adds. It's not clear that it does anything. And I'm speaking about memory and language and navigation, problem solving, all sorts of things can be done, even reading with comprehension, even recognizing a familiar face and so on. It's easy to demonstrate experimentally. So this leads me to my next point, which is that I agree with Chalmers that we can't, it is puzzling looking for the function of consciousness in relation, if our model example is a cognitive form of consciousness, and by the way, the model example in consciousness studies has been vision. The main focus has been since Crick's time on vision. Let's try and understand what's going on in the cortex when you're having conscious vision versus non-conscious vision, and then the difference between the two is the so-called neural correlate of consciousness, and then let's drill down into that, and then we'll understand what consciousness does, what it's for, and how it works, and it has been singularly unsuccessful. And I say again, the reason for that is because cognition is not an intrinsically conscious function, and cortex is not intrinsically conscious. So we're looking in the wrong place. We're looking at the wrong type of mental functioning. If we're wanting to understand consciousness, we should, in fact, rather be looking at affect than cognition. And here's the one mention of Freud. Freud, I thought, was the best person to quote in this regard, because he is, as I said, famously responsible for making us aware of how much of our mental life is unconscious, and yet even Freud says the following: "It's surely of the essence of an emotion that we should be aware of it. That is, that it should become known to consciousness. Thus, the possibility of the attribute of unconsciousness would be completely excluded as far as emotions, feelings, and affects are concerned." Now, this is not an appeal to authority. I'm just wanting to make you aware that even Freud was of the view. I could have appealed to the Oxford English Dictionary. By definition, a feeling is felt. It makes absolutely no sense to speak of this mental function called feeling without reference to consciousness. So if you're wanting to understand the elemental form, the foundational form, the basic form of consciousness, start with those mental functions which are intrinsically conscious. Don't start with those that are intrinsically unconscious. You're going to get lost. So I say this is where we start to cast an entirely different light on the problem. I think that it's entirely reasonable to ask the question, what is the function of affect? Because the function of affect has to explain why it feels like something. Unlike vision and cognition in general, which, as I say, does not necessarily have to feel like something. Feelings do have to feel like something. Everything that feelings do, they do because you feel them. In fact, as I showed you with the hydranencephalic kids, and in fact, decorticate animals, you see the same thing. You can remove the whole of cortex, and the animal remains conscious and emotionally responsive, as do human beings. And this we knew since 1949, when Magoon and Maruzzi first identified the reticular activating system, which was a huge surprise. As I said, the standard view was that the cortex is the organ of consciousness, consciousness streams in through our senses, and yet what Magoon and Maruzzi showed was that consciousness, in fact, is an endogenous property of the brain. It's generated from deep within the centroencephalic core, as they called it, and later called the reticular activating system. Consciousness is generated in the upper brain stem. It does not fly in through your senses. And when they discovered this, they were in a bit of a tiz, because this threw everything out the window that we always understood about consciousness. And so they fudged it by drawing a distinction, which is still with us today, between what's called the level of consciousness and the contents of consciousness. So the contents were still attributed to the cortex, the qualities of consciousness, and its level, that sort of volume control switch, was attributed to the brainstem, and this was thought of in quantitative terms, like the Glasgow Coma scale. You measure how much consciousness there is out of 15, whereas what cortex does is provide the contents and the qualities of consciousness. Now, this is a nonsense. It's just not true. It's just not true that what the upper brainstem produces is only a level of consciousness. And I've already showed you the dramatic example of the hydranencephalic little girl, and I've made reference to decorticate animals. Decorticate mammals, decorticated neonates, they grow up fine. They have full-blown lives. They raise kids. You know, it's incredible how much you can do instinctually and emotionally without cognitive consciousness, without cortex. Now, I said that I was going to touch on psychiatric matters, and this is where I touch on them. Perhaps it's easiest to make my point to you as psychiatrists by reminding you that many of your mainstream medications are, in fact, you're acting on the neuromodulatory systems, which are reticular activating system circuits. Your antipsychotics act on this circuit over here, this mesocortical mesolimbic dopaminergic system, which has its source cells here in the ventral tegmental area, part of the reticular activating system. Same applies to your antidepressants, which act on RAFE nuclei. You know, well, at least the source cells are in the RAFE. So you're fiddling with serotonin. You're in fact fiddling with reticular activating system. The same applies to noradrenaline, which has its source cells in the nucleus locus coeruleus complex. These things that you guys tinker with are feelings. They are states of mind. These are emotional disorders that you're treating. You're not treating levels of consciousness in a purely quantitative sense at all. So what we're talking about in terms of what the reticular activating system contributes is not just a level, it's not just quantitative, it's not just volume control, it has content and quality of its own, and this content and quality we call affect. And this, of course, is much more ancient than cortex. This is where consciousness began. And as I said, you can't speak of the feeling of an affect without it being conscious. And what Magoon and Maruzzi's studies showed us from the get-go, although they didn't know that they were talking about affect, was that this is the foundational form of consciousness in the sense that if these structures are lesioned, all consciousness goes. But it doesn't work the other way around. You can remove all of cortex, you still have consciousness. You remove the tiniest piece. In fact, in the parabrachial complex over there, you remove 2 cubic millimeters of tissue, and you have coma. So this is where consciousness comes from, and consciousness is fundamentally affective. Had I more time, I would be going into oodles of evidence about this. I've just given you, the highlights and the dramatic pictures. Of course, you all know about stimulation studies, deep brain stimulation of these structures. There was the famous study in the late 90s of the woman who had, she was having deep brain stimulation for Parkinson's, and accidentally the electrode went into substantia nigra, and she went into a massive suicidal depression on the operating table, just like that, with absolutely no psychiatric history. So there's lots and lots and lots of evidence that what these structures generate is affect, not just a level of consciousness. What affect adds is the capacity to feel your state, so that you can feel your way through a situation in terms of what you're going to do about it. So, for example, suffocation alarm, you feel it. Most of the time, your blood gases are regulated automatically, but when you're in a state of air hunger, you know all about it. And there's this intense affect, suffocation alarm, air hunger, and it says, do something. And this is what affects are for. They tell the animal, us included, you better do something, mate. If you don't get out of this state, you're gone. And the same applies to thermoregulation, the same applies to hunger, the same applies to thirst. That's what affects are for. They have an obvious function, they have an obvious place in nature, they obviously do something. They're not just fluff that's added on. And this is why I say that my excuse for talking to you as psychiatrists also is to remind you that what you deal with is absolutely fundamental to life. That this is what the mind is for. It's for feeling, so that we know how we're doing in relation to our basic biological needs. In states of uncertainty, so there are homeostatic functions which work automatically, and then there are those where you need to be able to feel your way through the situation, to know, is it going badly? Am I getting further from where I need to be? That's what unpleasurable feelings are. That's the red arrow. Am I getting back to where I need to be? That's pleasurable feelings. That's the blue arrow. And where you want to be is on the black line, which is your homeostatic settling point. In other words, feelings are a sort of an alarm mechanism. They're telling you that you're not where you want to be, you're not where you need to be, and you're going in the wrong direction or you're going in the right direction. This is the basic Damasio view of what affects are for, what their function is. And as I keep saying, I think this casts an entirely different light on the question of how and why consciousness arises. Now, I'm speaking about basic bodily affects, things like suffocation, alarm, thirst, hunger, and the like. But the same applies also to emotions. These are obviously not as immediately life-threatening or life-sustaining as are those bodily affects, but they function according to the same basic principles. Fear is probably a good example. You know, fear is there for very good biological reasons, that you feel, oh my God, I'm in danger, this predator is coming for me. And there's a prediction that's built into you as to what you need to do. What you need to do is freeze, or you need to flee. These are instinctual responses. But that's not enough. Life is far more complicated than to be dealt with just in terms of either I freeze or I flee. You need to learn from experience. And so the feeling of your way through the situation enables us to elaborate these automatic instinctual responses. And this is how all of these basic emotions work. They too are ultimately there for our survival and our reproductive success. Emotions are very important things. They do something. And you can't just say, well, like Damasio says about vision. I mean, not Damasio, sorry, Chalmers says about vision. Blue and red, you know, these qualia of the what it is like to see. It wouldn't make any difference if you saw red where I see blue. They don't do anything. You know, I could call it blue and you call it red. It doesn't make any difference. It's just fluff. But imagine if the same were to apply to these things. Imagine if instead of feeling fear, you feel separation distress, and then as that line's coming from you, you cry, "Mama," and you hug her. You know, you'll be dead. So what emotions do, what they compel us to do, their causal consequences are easily understood within a natural scientific biological frame of reference. You know that little game we played as kids where you're blindfolded and you're trying to find somebody, so you're getting hotter, you're getting hotter, you're getting colder, you're getting colder, works like that. So it's more and more unpleasure within each one of the modalities of affect means you're heading in the wrong direction, you're getting more hungry, you're getting more thirsty, you're getting more cold. And then the pleasure of, drinking, that's what you needed. Eating, that's what you needed. A nice warm duvet, that's what I needed. That's the pleasure which says you're heading in the right direction, carry on this way, that's good. So there's plenty of room for positive affect. But even with the most extreme of positive affects, you know, like, dare I mention orgasms again, eventually it's enough already, you know, that's called satiation. And it's the same with chocolate, even chocolate, you know, eventually it's like, okay. So it's not that we're seeking, Freud made a mistake in that respect, by the way, that Freud thought there was this continuum, that the pleasure principle, we're aiming for more and more and more pleasure all the time. It's actually a homeostatic mechanism like this, it's an alternator. And what we're really aiming for is satiation. In other words, need is met, then you don't feel anything at all. So the feelings, both pleasurable and unpleasurable, say correctly, as you pointed out, that you are not in your settling point, you're not at the satiation point. But pleasurable feelings certainly have an important function, which say you're heading in the right direction. Unpleasurable. Now, there's one complication, in fact, there are many complications, but just one headline complication, which you haven't actually said, but when I'm going to put these words into your mouth, is that they are thrill-seeking and risk-taking and novelty-seeking and so on. These kinds of behaviors are very difficult to fit into this kind of simple homeostatic mechanism. And that's where it's important to recognize that the different affects work in different ways. Although they're all homeostatic, the most important one is what we call seeking. It's a sort of foraging affect, which is the default mode of our affective systems, which is that you can't just rest on your laurels. You're constantly having to be testing out new things, trying out new things, because the world is full of uncertainties. So our understanding of how that system works, this so-called brain reward system, which is a bad word for it because there's so many different types of reward. But here in that dopaminergic seeking system or foraging system, it's a matter of finding uncertainty in order to reduce it. So it's actually looking for uncertainty in order to be able to reduce it. And that's a sort of a paradoxical version of what nevertheless is the same thing. Probably the best way to think about that is that the same mechanism, except the arrows go around this side rather than around that side. I would just distill it down to this one essential point, which is that I think that feelings are the bridge. Affect is the bridge. It's important for us to start with the most basic of affects to properly understand that. To remember that affect, the dawn of consciousness for me, is the beginnings of a creature knowing its own state. This is not, as I said, something fluffy. And I'm putting it this way because I know, I'm a psychoanalyst, which is even worse than a psychiatrist. But psychiatrists also, you suffer all the time from, it's not proper medicine, and it's not real stuff, and so on. And this is why I'm wanting to emphasize this point. Affect is absolutely fundamental. It's extremely important aspect of our physiology, of our biology, of how we survive and reproduce. It is what matters. To each and every one of us. Our patients suffer from feelings. Even our surgical patients suffer from feelings. Feeling is absolutely fundamental. But remember that we mustn't start with things like, even a word like happiness is a very cognitively abstracted, elaborated thing. We need to start with the most basic of affects. In order to understand the dawn of consciousness, we need to understand the biological, adaptive advantage of being able to know my state in terms of my own thermodynamics, as it were, in terms of my own entropic, am I going to dissipate and disappear, or am I going to survive? I need to stay within this narrow range. This is where I need to be if I'm not going to dissipate. Affect is, as I say, a sort of an alarm mechanism in relation to that. Then we elaborated from basic affects, basic bodily affects like pain and suffocation alarm and so on, to the emotional affects, which are also, when you think about them in the terms that I've just briefly alluded to, in terms of like fear and rage and lust and so on, separation, distress, nurture and care and so on. These things are fundamental to the survival of the creatures who are endowed with these things. Then we get these much higher cognitive elaborations of them. But that is the bridge between neuroscience and psychology, the bridge between ultimately even physics and consciousness, is understanding this. Affect is not a very complicated thing. And yet it's at the heart of both of our disciplines. Yeah. Perhaps this is the best slide to illustrate the main point I'm making in relation to that. It goes to your point also. Of course, I agree that the capacity to mentalize, to cognize your affects, to reflect upon them, to know it's me who's feeling this thing, this is what it means to me, that reminds me of the following, and it makes me project myself into the future and imagine different scenarios, and if I do this, it feels like that, and all of that happens, and as I have said repeatedly, I'm jolly glad it happens, I'm very glad we have those things, but that's really not the heart of affect. Affect doesn't require all of those things. Those are all sort of add-ons. And so when Joseph Ledoux says prefrontal cortex has to read it out, Feldman Barrett, all the more so, that she literally thinks that the naming of the affect, the labeling of it is how it comes into being, and until we give a name to the thing, it doesn't exist. And that's why I put this example on the screen. Can you not feel an orgasm without naming it? It's ridiculous. The idea that you have to have some sort of cognitive elaboration, recognition, appraisal of the affect in order for it to do its job, I think is just not true. Suffocation alarm, is another example. It's just, when you have that feeling, it's absolutely obligatory to act in a certain way. The rewards and the punishments of these feelings are in and of themselves causal. Then, of course, we have cognitive elaborations of them. But the cognitive elaboration is just that. It's elaboration. It's not the fundamental thing. Well, the brainstem mechanisms that we're talking about, the sort of core, by the way, all of those basic emotion structures, the limbic ones, the circuits that I had on the screen earlier, all of these ultimately project down to periaqueductal gray. Absolutely every affective system projects ultimately to periaqueductal gray. So the sort of nexus, the core of our affective brain is the upper brainstem, is the midbrain. And what goes on there is really has nothing to do with learning. These are absolutely hardwired structures, that they are completely the same in every single vertebrate, and they do the same thing. Then there's cognitive elaborations of that. Cortex, I mean, you forgive me for saying this, and I know I'm making an extreme statement, but to me, cortex is like random access memory space. There's really very little from the point of view of genetics that we're going to learn about cortex. The outstanding examples of this are, you can remove the left hemisphere. As long as you do it young enough, everything shifts over to the right, and vice versa. These things are incredibly adaptive. There's the famous study with ferrets where you redirect the optic nerve or the optic tracts from occipital cortex to temporal cortex, and then temporal cortex sees. I mean, it just learns how to see. This is what I mean by random access memory space. So I think that the memory aspects, the learning aspects, we're talking about forebrain functions. And again, these are not things to be sneezed at. They are enormously important in terms of the flexible adaptive capacities of species who are endowed with cortex. But the basic affective mechanisms, which are upper brainstem mechanisms, really have very little to do with cognition and with learning, and you find those mechanisms in fish. No. Well, the question is the definition of consciousness, and I've equated it with affect. And he says, what about dreaming? Is dreaming a form of consciousness? And yes, of course it is. And this is the great interest about dreams, is that it's a conscious state that punctuates the unconsciousness of sleep. And the question then arises, why do we have to become conscious while we're asleep? And if you define consciousness, as I do, as fundamentally an affective function, and cognition, in conscious cognition, is an attempt to master the problem, in other words, to meet the need, to reduce, to get rid of the error. And I think that the learning process, the consolidation mechanisms of what goes on during sleep, that the reason we have to become conscious during sleep is because we're working our way through offline, as it were, through problems which have arisen during the day. And there's a lot of evidence for the view that memory consolidation is a very important part of what goes on during sleep, and in particular during dreaming sleep. So the feeling state of dreaming, I think, is fundamental to the consciousness of dreaming. The affective dimension of dreaming is fundamental to what dreaming is all about. It's working our way through problems offline, which is the safest place to do it, rather than while you're on the roof.
All right, Mark. Thank you so much.
Thanks very much. I'm leaving this on the screen so that you can ask yourself that question. Can we really have affect without experience?